Welcome, everyone, to this episode of Feeding the Wolf a Possibility. Oh, possibilities, actually. It's a multitude of possibilities. And today we're exploring possibilities of X-Men. What does it mean to be an X-Men, and why is knowing that you are one helpful? So as our guide, I've invited Diva Diaz, who has a background in business intelligence and now is a lead facilitator for the Access Consciousness specialty X-Men. Welcome, Diva.
Thank you. It's great to be here, Kat.
So what does it mean to be an X-Men?
Good question. X-Men is a name that we affectionately give people who are neurodivergent and who either have or have not been labeled with anything from OCD to ADHD and autism. But I say have or have not been labeled because it really applies to such a huge number of people that perhaps have never had any symptoms that were that, affecting their daily lives enough that they would then go out and get an official diagnosis.
Right.
But yeah, it's our affectionate way of saying, hey, what if there's nothing wrong with you? What if there are some incredible capacities here? Let's explore them and let's see what you're actually aware of that you perhaps haven't explored up until now.
So what did it change for you when you realized that you have these capacities, that you're an X-Men or a neurodivergent, like whatever you call it, but what did it change for you in your life?
It made a lot of things make sense. So a huge amount of the, I would say what I'd called personality traits that I had that I'd seen as negative or things that I needed to work on to improve, although I kept working on them and they didn't improve, like it was impossible to improve them. Those things that made me be like, oh, I'll just hide that in the background. Hopefully nobody will really notice. Hopefully I won't let it show too much. Those things, when I realized that they were actually traits of, in my case, particularly autism and ADHD, it really changed so much for me because it took me out of this self-criticism and looking for what was wrong with me. Why am I not like other people? Why do people have so much ease doing X simple thing? And for me, it's so complicated, yet doing other complicated things are so easy. And so I'd say the main thing was like the perspective that I had about myself really changed. And in that, what I experienced was it was a lot easier to live with that, whatever it was that I had going on, and actually start to embrace it and stop looking at myself as a problem.
Could you give an example?
Yeah, like one of the things was that I just never sleep. I really haven't just never slept very much. And so, when I worked in the corporate world, my colleagues found it very weird because we would be on the field, so you'd be living in houses with people or staying in hotels with people. They kind of notice your sleep patterns to a certain extent, or they'd be like, why were you texting me at 4 a.m.? And so, and a lot of them started to say to me, oh, you must be so exhausted. And so then I'd think, well, I should probably be exhausted, shouldn't I? Or, like you should get some sleeping pills. And I'm not somebody that likes to take any kind of medication, but, so there were all these suggestions. So then I'd be like, okay, then I've got to sleep more because they sleep more and that's healthy. When I realized afterwards that I have had this forever since I was tiny. I've always been a night owl. I've always had a lot of energy. When I'm tired, I sleep. When I don't, I don't. When I'm not, I don't. But it allowed me to realize that actually I have an incredible amount of energy that is generative. It's not because I have a problem and there's something wrong with me physically or chemically. I just have a lot of energy. And so I started to then ask, all right, how do I use this to my advantage? How can I use this to be generative in life? And so I could never have got there if I kept thinking, this is wrong, I've got to fix it. I have to go to another acupuncture session. I have to go to another, some kind of thing to cleanse my aura so that I won't have negative energy keeping me awake the whole night or whatever, And I started to really see the generative side of things. And I recognized that, I actually can be doing a lot more than the average person. And I can use that in a way that's really generative for me. Like I used to also, I used it's funny I say used to, but I still do things very quickly and have people comment and say like, hey, can you just not, can you stop doing that? Can you stop being so quick? That's supposed to take you like a day and a half. You did it in 5 minutes. And so even to slow down was something that for me required a lot of effort. And it also required me to constantly have to be like gauging people around me and their reactions towards me to see if I was behaving in a way that they could accept or not. When I realized like, oh, I'm just really fast. I have autism. Of course, my brain functions so much faster than somebody who isn't neurodivergent. Then I no longer had to try and slow it down. I didn't have to try and see how people were reacting around me, if I was palatable enough for them or not. And I could actually just kind of fly and do things my way, knowing that it was my way. It was not a disability that I had.
Well, did that then allow you to, I know it sounds weird, but find more or develop more capacities?
Yeah,
Like?
definitely. Well, I'd say, the thing for me that's interesting with the X-Men capacities is they're not so separate. It's kind of like when you're happy, you're not only happy, with that one tiny thing. Like if you love the coffee that you have, you're probably going to be really happy in the environment that you're in, and you're going to like the cup also, and you're going to smile at the person that's next to you. It kind of infuses your whole reality. And so for me, when you start to discover capacity kind of infuses your whole reality, and everything that gets incorporated into everything. So, realizing that I did have a ton of energy suddenly got incorporated into everything. So areas where I perhaps was like, oh, this is a bit boring. Do I really need to be doing this? Even then, I was able to do that faster and with more energy, because I was like, oh, I don't need to be held back by this. Like, how quickly can I do this? The thing about the speed, I realized, oh, well, if people are uncomfortable with that, that's their discomfort. It actually doesn't need to be relevant to me, which of course has a knock-on effect in so many other areas, recognizing that actually people's discomfort around X-Men, around neurodivergent people, is usually what gets them to judge them. But it's actually nothing to do with what the X-Men is all about, or what they're being, or what they're doing even. It's literally just the other person's discomfort in it. And so recognizing that someone else's discomfort is actually not really relevant also had this huge knock-on effect in so many other areas.
Right.
So I know I kind of answered your question and kind of didn't.
No, it's kind of like speed is one of your superpowers, and you manage to speed everything up once you get away from the judgment of having speed.
Exactly.
So when you do classes, X-Men classes all over the world, what would you say is one of the more like surprising capacities that people have not been acknowledging? One of the most surprising that's come up in a class?
Yeah, I would say the capacity with money comes up a lot. A lot of X-Men tend to think that they are completely messed up with money in particular, I find. And one of the things that I've discovered, and obviously through all the work of Access Consciousness and all of the tools, is if there's one area that you think you're really messed up in, it's quite likely that's going to be a capacity that you have that you just, for whatever reason, are not recognizing, or something like that. Excuse me. So with X-Men, they don't function in a linear way like neurotypical people do. So for them, doing things in order, doing things in a way that makes logical sense is not a capacity that they are born with. They have to work very, very hard to try and develop that. And even when they try and develop that, it's not natural to them. And so if you look at the way that money is generated in society and in the world, most of it is done in a very linear way. It's done through, A plus B equals C. It's done through, you do these 3 things and you get this amount of money. You do more, you get more. And so it's a very linear construct, which if you're a linear thinker, fabulous, and you're in absolute luck. I mean, go for it, like, have fun, you're going to do great. But if you're not a linear thinker, you're going to look at this and you're going to be like, what is going on? I cannot seem to bend myself in the right direction for long enough to sustain this. And so what I've discovered is a lot of the people who think that they are messed up with money that are X-Men actually have an incredible capacity to generate and produce it. However, it's not the same way that everybody else does. So they have to look at it from a far more creative way. And I don't mean about being artistic. I mean being creative in your own mind and letting go of what you think you should be doing, and the order, primarily the order in which you need to be doing things in, or even the speed at which you need to be doing things in. And so simple things like asking a question every day, like what requires my attention today for a project, your work, your job, your business, your household, whatever, allows that huge amount of information that exists in a non-linear way to suddenly be organized so that you know what requires your attention first. It's super simple, super practical. But when you do that kind of overwhelming world of extra and extreme information that X-Men live in suddenly becomes something that they can work with, and is not just a ton of noise in their minds. It's something that they can organize. And that, to me, has been, for me personally, and for a lot of people that I've worked with, one of the fastest and easiest ways to turn around their money situation, not by trying to be more like everybody else, but by taking the vast amount of information and awareness and capacity that they have available and just organizing it through asking questions that lets them know what a priority is versus what they should be doing.
And not a linear priority, a priority that's based on awareness of everything.
Exactly.
If you look at your groups, how do they differ?
Oh, that's a good question. It's funny. I wouldn't say age really has much to do with it. I've had classes where there are people who are, definitely older, who have these huge aha moments, and they say things like, why didn't I have this information 50 years ago when I was growing up?
Yeah.
And then there are others who are like 18 and resistant to everything that you say because it doesn't match what they're seeing on TikTok. So I think it really depends on the person's openness to not even to have something amazing, but to just not judge. Not judge that they're wrong, and not judge that someone else has it right, or that they're right in how wrong they are. You know how sometimes we can get into that, like, but look, here's the proof. Look how messed up I am. I'm right. I'm telling you. So you try and get in there, you ask them a question or you offer a different perspective, and they're like, no, I'm right. I'm still so messed up.
Well, that's interesting, because this whole idea of diagnosis, people use that in such a different way. So how do you kind of like avoid the solidification by you are autistic or you are, whatever, and go into the possibility? Because what I see in today's world is that the diagnosis can sometimes create a relief, but then it also creates kind of like a definition or a conclusion around what's wrong with me.
Yeah. I think the key thing is, to recognize that a diagnosis is somebody's opinion, albeit professional opinion. You can use it to your advantage. To me, when I was officially diagnosed as autistic, it did create some ease. But actually, I think the easiest thing is to just stay in the question, like what is actually relevant to me? Because even if you've got a diagnosis of, let's use OCD as an example, it can present itself in infinite ways. And depending on your mood, it will present itself in infinite ways in one day in your life, let alone if you try and compare it to other people. So the key thing is to ask each person, each X-Men, and if you're the X-Men, ask yourself, what's relevant here? What am I perceiving today? What's going on for me here right now today? What's going on for this person right now? Just like you would with anybody else that doesn't have a diagnosis. Like, are you in a bad mood? Are you in a good mood? Is it because you've eaten? Is it because you stubbed your toe? Like, you're rarely assuming it's the same thing, or the level or intensity of the mood is the same as it was 5 days ago, So I think we have to start being willing to really communicate with the person, not just the symptom or the diagnosis, which is what I see happen so often. It's like, oh, now you've got a diagnosis. Let's communicate with the diagnosis, with the label. Let's deal with the symptoms. Yeah, absolutely. Do all of that if that's working for you. And what if you also address the being? What if you address that person?
Well, it's interesting because when you say presents itself different, right? So it presents different depending on the day, the context, the situation, the interaction. And one of the things that I've noticed is that sometimes our X-Men capacities are capacities that go beyond the capacities we think we have. They present themselves in emergency situations. So could you talk a little bit about that? Like how sometimes when we really need it, we're able to step into these capacities that we actually have all the time.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I don't know if you've had it, and I'm sure people listening, but whether you have a, a label of some sort or not, I'm sure you've had some kind of emergency situation where in that moment, you don't have time to sit there and fret and worry about how your hair looked and how annoyed you are with your partner because they left the toilet seat up. Like you just handle the stuff that's going on, And so imagine that, but on steroids, where on top of that, on top of just having to handle what's going on, you suddenly bring out the big guns and you're like, okay, now I've got some really cool abilities. Now I can be even faster. Now I can use my non-linear thinking to really read the situation energetically, go with my gut, go with my intuition, go with my knowing, and take actions that may have taken other people 5 minutes. I've done it in 3 seconds, And so most of these capacities, the moment that you take judgment and even cognition out of it, I don't mean lose your mind and go wild and crazy, but what I mean is stop trying to figure out how to use your abilities. Just do it, just be present. That's when it's going to show up. And so very often we're forced into those situations when it's an emergency. But actually, it's not the emergency causing it, it's the lack of judgment that's causing it.
True. We don't have time to judge in those particular situations.
Yeah.
So what do you get it would be like if people, young, old, everyone, were encouraged to explore and embrace and discover our unique capacities, our X-Men capacities. And neurodivergent is one part, and that's like the more less normal ones. But in general, like, what do you think the world would be like if that was actually something that was sought after, that was encouraged?
Yeah. I love that question. To be honest, that's really been one of my biggest targets with facilitating these X-Men classes forever, empowering people so they can actually discover these unique abilities that they have, and also getting out of judgment of them. Because again, you can't access your ability from behind the wall of self-criticism. They're 2 different universes. You either choose one or the other. But I think a lot of what we see now that isn't working, like people who are depressed, people who have a sense that they don't know how to create the future. Things seem so uncertain nowadays, from everything from economy to families. Like so many of the structures and constructs that we grew up with are now changing. Internet, all of that stuff. I don't need to go through the whole list, but I think if we start to really explore like what's unique about me, what will start to happen is that, one, you're going to have people who are a lot less dependent on following others. And in doing so, what you're going to create is a new generation of, regardless the age, but a whole new wave of people who are leaders. And I don't mean leaders like presidents. I mean people who are in their lives, they're willing to take action and choose things that work for them, but also work for everybody around them. So not to the exclusion of others. Because when you have an ability for creation, it very rarely is an ability that excludes people. Like, I think people have this wild idea that, one of the things that comes up sometimes in the X-Men classes is, well, if I choose all of my abilities and capacities, isn't that really mean on everybody else? And I'm like, what makes you think that? When have you had a capacity and it caused damage to somebody? And people usually think about it and they're like, oh, rarely, because the capacity isn't designed for that. It's really when you're being all of you, you're including everybody in that creation. So I think it would create a world that is just a lot more inclusive, less judgmental, and with people that are more willing to lead and go with their knowing rather than depending on being told what to do in life.
And it's definitely a world I would like more of.
Yes, indeed.
So finally, like if somebody's listening to this and they would like to start exploring their capacities, what are some great tools to start exploring this, to start playing with, just to see how they function with themselves?
Yeah. Oh, good question. I'd say one of my go-tos for absolutely everything is when you're out in your day and you may get in a bad mood or you may feel a little bit anxious, start asking, is this mine? Because one of the greatest capacities that we have is a capacity for perception and for being incredibly and very acutely aware of the people around us and our environment, the mood in general, the news, what's happening in our towns, let alone in our countries and the world. And I think we don't give that enough credit. So we tend to kind of be just swept along the wave of insanity rather than asking, hey, is this mood mine? Are these worries and thoughts, are they really mine, or are they something that I'm picking up or that I've learned? That tends to cause create a lot of freedom, for people when they start recognizing, oh, actually, I might just be going along with the flow of the way that other people are feeling or thinking right now. What's my unique take on this? Like, what's my perspective on this? What do I know? Would be the next question. What do I know here? To start really getting a sense of what's true for you, so that you don't have to be swept along with everybody else and have that be your only option. And then the final one is, I would probably ask, what's right about me that I'm not getting? Because a lot of X-Men have the wonderful tendency to go into self-judgment a lot. Why? Because they're different. And when you're different and you don't see anybody else that's really similar to you or the same as you, it can be very easy to jump to the conclusion that there must be something wrong with you, since you're different to the masses. So once you start asking what's right about me, it doesn't mean that you then hate everybody else and they're terrible and you're the best. It's not about that level of, that's also judgment, but it's about you starting to be a bit easier on yourself and notice in your day-to-day some of the things that are actually unique and wonderful about you that perhaps you don't notice. You take them for granted because they're just you. Pick that up.
So we already given some tools for getting practical with your capacities and abilities. And if people want to explore this more with you, for example, in a class, where do they find out more about X-Men as a specialty and about you as a facilitator?
Yeah, there's a ton of stuff about the X-Men specialty on the Access Consciousness website and also on YouTube. So please go and check it out. There are a bunch of videos there and a lot of free, really great content. Free with Access Consciousness doesn't mean it's less valuable. It just means that for whatever reason it's been given for free, but please don't think that you're getting a lesser version than if you paid. And then you can find me on my website, divadiaz.com, or on the Access Consciousness site as well.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And what requires our attention right now? That's what's next. Thank you again for coming on. Thank you so much for listening to my podcast, Feeding the Wolf of Possibilities. I hope you have more space in your world now. If you would like to listen to earlier episodes, share with other people, or subscribe, please go to Spotify, iTunes, or visit KatarinaValentin.com/wolf.